Thank you, Roxana. Thank you to everyone for inviting me. I have to say that when I normally go to give a talk, I always want to do it right away, so then I can talk to people about the work. But in this trip, we did it the other way around. And it's been a wonderful 2 days, and I've really enjoyed meeting all of you with whom I've had an opportunity to talk. If anyone who's standing out there wants to sit, there are lots of places to sit up here, and why don't you do that right now? There are a number of places up here in the front row. I want to start by just very briefly acknowledging many, many people with whom I've worked, students and former students and collaborators, and the support that I've had from a number of different external sources. And I particularly want to recognize the International Network for Research on Bilingualism and Language Learning that we established at Penn State and that I've been able to bring with me in part to University of California, Riverside through the support of an NSF PIRE grant, which stands for Partnerships for International Research and Education. When you do research on bilingualism for a long time in central Pennsylvania, perhaps not so unlike being in Columbia, Missouri, you need to have friends in other places in the world and collaborators. And those friendships and collaborations are very rich and very generous and create opportunities for all of us, both faculty and students alike, to pursue this research. So more than a decade ago, on the 125th anniversary of the journal Science, Kennedy and Norman wrote an editorial for Science that identified the biological basis of second language learning as one of the top 125 questions to be answered in the next 25 years of research. And this is what's critical in all of science. So this was identified as a critical issue for all of science, and all of science is quite large. And what you can see in this little graph from Web of Science is in this period of time, there has been a very clear upsurge of research on, this is for research on second language acquisition and bilingualism. This is another set of graphs on the same, showing the same kind of data. The data on the left are data from Web of Science for a number of papers published on bilingualism. The data on the right are the citations of those data. There has been nothing short of a virtual explosion of research on bilingualism. And in part, there is a new attitude about bilingualism. Monolingualism is the illiteracy of the 21st century. The language and learning sciences, I'd like to argue, have come to see that bilingualism is really a tool for revealing the workings of language, the mind, and the brain. Bilingualism is interesting for many, many reasons. It's interesting in its own right, but it's also a crucial tool for those of us who are cognitive scientists. So what have we learned in this upsurge of research? Well, one thing we've learned is that recent neuroscience evidence has really called into question the hard constraints on second language learning that we used to think existed. So proficiency in a second language may be more important than age at which you acquire a second language. And we've learned that the brain may outpace behavior in revealing second language learning. The bottom line in this work is that there is far greater plasticity than previously understood. Learning occurs at all ages. It may occur in different ways. It may still be easier for a child to learn a second language than for an adult to learn a second language. But it is not only possible for adults to learn a second language, but it's possible for there to be consequences, cognitive and neural consequences of that learning. The consequences may sometimes be somewhat counterintuitive. Proficient bilinguals are not monolingual-like in their native language. And that suggests that the native language itself is open to change and influence of acquiring the second language. And what we're going to see is that competition across the two languages comes to reshape the networks that support each of the languages. Now, if you step back for a moment and you read the media, and we all do, because we're all plugged in all of the time, we hear a lot about bilingual advantages. So we hear that bilingualism is good for the brain. We get a lot of advice out there about what we should do in our lives, what we should eat, how we should exercise. And one piece of advice is that we should learn a second language if we don't have one already, because being bilingual may have certain cognitive benefits. Bilingualism is like a mental gymnasium for the brain. Juggling languages can build better brains. So we hear a lot about this. And we even hear, this is from Thomas Botton at University of Edinburgh, who's making a little bit of a joke, but a recent talk that he gave actually last week was titled, "Is Monolingualism Making Us Ill?" So bilingualism may be the norm rather than the exception. So in the last year alone, there are fantastic findings across the entire lifespan suggesting that being exposed to two languages, learning two languages, and being proficient in two languages may really come to have profound consequences for cognition and brain function. The first example I have here is an example from Patricia Kroll's lab at the University of Washington. And this is a MEG study, brain imaging study with little babies, that shows that babies who are raised in a bilingual environment, so you wouldn't want to say that baby is bilingual already itself, because these babies are not really talking, but babies exposed to two languages from birth begin to show neural changes as early as 11 months. Areas of the brain that are associated with cognitive control and executive function are different in bilingually exposed babies than in monolingually exposed babies. This kind of research, again, has been made possible by the advent of neuroscience methods that allow us to test babies under these conditions. Very exciting. The second example is actually from Thomas Bach's laboratory in Edinburgh. And this is a study where they exposed adults of all ages to new language learning. They had an intensive language learning course, and they compared the intensive language learning with control groups who learned a bunch of other things. And what they found is that a brief new language learning experience improved attentional abilities even for older learners. And only the language learning had these consequences, not learning another new skill. So all of this raises the question of how does this happen? What happens when bilinguals use language that changes their cognition? The person who's probably most associated with these cognitive changes with bilingualism is Ellen Bialystok, who's on the faculty at York University in Toronto. And Bialystok has been a pioneer in examining this issue across the lifespan for young children and young adults and older adults. And the claim that she makes, based upon the work she's done, is that bilingualism offers rather specific benefits to executive function and attention that enable bilinguals to ignore irrelevant information, resolve conflict among competing alternatives, and minimize the costs associated with task switching. So the idea is that bilingualism doesn't necessarily make you smarter. It doesn't provide benefits in all domains of life, but that it may have some very specific consequences cognitively. Now, I want to illustrate what some of these consequences might be, and some of the more profound illustrations come from research on imaging, on neuroimaging. This is a study by Jubin Abishalevi and colleagues in Milan. And the title of this is Bilingualism Tunes the Anterior Cingulate Cortex for Conflict Monitoring. On the right, you have an example of a very common cognitive task that's been used to examine executive function, the flanker task. And the kinds of, those of you who are not cognitive psychologists basically pretend they have serious laboratories. Well, what they do is they invent little parlor tricks in their lab and have people play these games on the computer. And what we do from their performance on those games is that we try to infer the nature of their mental processes. And so what you have on the right is you have this flanker task. And basically, the short version of this is that you see the arrow that's pointed to the right. Okay, so what your task is press a button on the right if you see the arrow pointed to the right, press a button on the left if you see the arrow pointed left. Very simple. And what you can do is you can surround that arrow either with other information that is consistent or in conflict with it. So if you have to press a button on the right and all the arrows are saying go that way, you're going to have a moment of confusion or conflict that you have to resolve. And the argument that's been made is that bilinguals might be better at doing that. And what this was done in this particular study was that they imaged people's brains while they performed this task. So it's not a language task, it's a cognitive task. And so what you do is you perform the task and you have bilinguals and monolinguals perform the task. And for our purposes today, the critical result is to look at, you see a small little red dot on the bilingual's brains, and you see the larger yellow in the monolingual? Well, the idea is that the anterior cingulate cortex is an area of the brain that's been hypothesized to be implicated in resolving conflict across alternative conflicting conditions. And it's not that monolinguals and bilinguals use a different part of their brain in solving this problem. It's that for monolinguals, there's a lot more activation of that area of the brain than there is for the bilinguals. And so the argument that they make is that bilinguals can solve the same problem much more efficiently. And so the argument is that a life of using two languages, of juggling the two languages, has created a skill, specifically in the domain of being able to resolve conflict. And you see this in these different brain regions. Now, life experience as a bilingual may change the mind and brain, particularly as we age and as the ability to resolve conflict may be compromised somewhat. I was saying, I've shown this slide before, and I say, I am not promoting smoking. Be very clear. I know there's a sign on every door that says we're a smoke-free campus. I'm with you completely, but I couldn't resist showing the picture. And we have no idea whether she's really bilingual or not. So the idea is that these changes may really be particularly striking in older adults. Now, cognitive decline is a normal part of cognitive aging, but what we see is that bilingualism may provide some protection against the rate of decline. Be clear, being bilingual is not going to protect you from aging. Okay, so you have to, it's not an antidote to aging. And so this is a study, again, by Judith and colleagues, and comparing bilinguals and monolinguals, and it's, again, this is an imaging study, but it's a structural imaging study looking at gray matter density. And here's the critical idea. The critical idea is they look at the structure of your brain, and they look at an area of the brain that's implicated to be important for attention processing. And they ask, well, how does that area decline as people age? And if you look at the monolingual data on the top, do you see that line going down? Do you see how the data on the top for the monolinguals are kind of depressing? What you see is the older you are, you don't even have to be that old, by the way. This graph starts at, what, 45? So, I mean, it's downhill pretty quickly. Okay, here's the really exciting result. The exciting result's on the bottom. The bilinguals don't show that effect. The bilinguals are just stable. So it's as if the bilinguals, by virtue of their language experience, are holding their own cognitively. And so what you see is you see consequences of bilingualism in older adults. And those results are particularly striking and particularly provocative in the face of pathology. A number of studies have shown that bilinguals, when they are going to develop Alzheimer's, and again, I'm going to be very clear about this, bilingualism does not protect you against Alzheimer's. But what bilingualism may do is it may protect you against the symptoms of Alzheimer's. And so what we see in these studies is that bilinguals present with dementia symptoms 4 to 5 years later than monolinguals. And the result in the Schweitzer study that I cited at the bottom here is that at the point where they're diagnosed, the bilingual brains are more diseased than the monolinguals. And so what's happened is that the bilinguals are compensated for the deleterious effects of dementia. They can sort of fake it, as it were, for a longer period of time before they are diagnosed with having dementia. And one of the Alati studies that I mentioned here is very striking, because sometimes people get very critical and say, well, these are all, maybe these are very highly educated, well-fed, older adults in Toronto, Canada, and maybe there's something demographically different about them, so maybe the bilinguals are just advantaged because of the particular properties of that group. The Alati study was done in India with a very large sample and showed that even among the population there, including individuals who have not had a high degree of education, maybe even literate, you see a benefit of bilingualism in the same way. And again, it's for about 4 to 5 years in delaying the onset of these symptoms that require the diagnosis. So this is Savannah Alati, who did that work, and she's also done this work on aphasia, and shown that, again, bilingualism does not, you have a stroke, and bilingualism is not going to avoid the stroke. But what bilingualism seems to do is it seems to facilitate cognitive rehabilitation. So bilinguals seem to be advantaged in how quickly they can recover mental functions relative to monolinguals. Now, all of this is very exciting, but some people have said, wait a second, hold the horses, this is way too over the top. And they think that the case for these bilingual advantages has maybe been overstated. And why have they say, so they say some studies show that the purported bilingual advantage may only be a myth. And there's some failures to replicate some of the studies that have been done. Particularly for young adults on behavioral measures. There's some failures to replicate for bilingual children. There have been questions raised about the demographics, although I think the studies on this are now pretty compelling that there are effects of demographics and SES in education, and no one is denying that they're not. There are effects of bilingualism over and above those effects. And then there's a claim that sometimes you see these benefits and sometimes you don't. And sometimes the task you're asking people to perform needs to be difficult for you to be able to see it. Sometimes if it's too easy, you don't see it. And so it's complicated. And the answer may really depend on who are the bilinguals you're studying, who are the monolinguals you're studying, what's their age, what's the context in which they acquired each language, are we measuring behavior or are we measuring the brain? And in fact, this really may not be the right question to ask. It may not be that there is a bilingual advantage. Bilingualism is a very complex life experience and it may have different consequences, not a simple advantage or not. So bilingualism has a very diverse set of consequences over the lifespan. The argument that I want to make in this talk today is that we need to understand language to understand these consequences of bilingualism. Now that may sound pretty silly because bilingualism is about language. But in fact, many of the studies on the consequences of bilingualism look at bilinguals versus monolinguals on cognitive tasks and don't really look very deeply at how they use language. And so I'm going to argue today that we need to focus on how bilinguals use language to be able to understand where these consequences may come from in the first place. And doing that is going to be a complex activity, but one that is really crucial to understand how these consequences arise. So, to start, there are 3 discoveries. I've organized my thoughts about this by saying that there are 3 discoveries, or probably more than 3 discoveries, but these are the 3 that I want to focus on. The first, and all of these are counterintuitive in some ways, the first is that both languages are always active and competing. So when a proficient bilingual uses one language, he or she may not be aware of the other language at all, because they can use one language and just have like choice. But in fact, all of the research suggests that the other language is percolated. It's there. You may not be consciously aware of it, but it is available and accessible. And that also is consistent with the observation and the neural evidence that shows that two languages are not separate in the brain. It's the same neural tissue that supports the use of each language. And so the two languages are supported by the same neural mechanisms, and coming to learn a second language means that the two languages are going to interact with one another. They're sitting in the same place together. So it's not that surprising that they might come up at the same time. One of the things that's interesting is that bilinguals very rarely, who are proficient, make the mistake of switching accidentally into the wrong language. And so bilinguals come to have a lot of control over how they use the two languages. And one aspect of that control affects the native language as well as the second language. The second discovery, or what I'm calling a discovery, is that the native language changes in response to learning and using a second language. And for some people, that seems like a very threatening thing to say. The idea that you sign up to learn another language and it's going to somehow ruin your native language, you might think, this is what I have. Or if you go and you study abroad, and we're going to talk about some immersion data in a moment, and you think, oh, am I going to lose my native language? It's just not a very comforting thought. But what we see is that bilingualism has consequences for both languages. And so what happens as individuals become proficient is that it's not just that they acquire proficiency in the second language, it's that the two languages change in response to language use. And in fact, it doesn't stop when you become proficient. And so from one context to the next, depending upon how you're using the two languages, you may have different kinds of interactions between them, and the native language may be modulated. The third observation is what I've been talking about so far today, that the consequences of bilingualism are not limited to language. We need to understand how brain networks are reorganized as a function of how language is used, and how that reorganization then impacts our cognitive life more generally. So just a very quick word on terminology. I'm a cognitive scientist, so I'm using bilingualism very broadly. I get asked this question all of the time. Historically, traditionally, people thought bilingualism meant you were a simultaneous bilingual from birth, and you used the two languages equally, you were balanced. Now, unbalanced here does not mean mentally unstable. It means that you have two languages that vary in how available they may be. We're going to distinguish bilingual groups with respect to proficiency in the second language, dominance in the two languages, age of acquisition, but we're going to consider anyone who actively uses two languages as being a kind of bilingual, and recognizing that there may be many kinds of bilinguals. So how does the mind and brain accommodate the presence of two languages? And as I said, the claim is that the bilingual is the mental juggler. This is a representation of a sort of prototypical Dutch English bilingual attempting to speak the name of this absolutely common object in the Netherlands. So next to tulips, bicycles, or if you've been to the Netherlands, there are bicycles everywhere. I used to say when I lived in the Netherlands, and I always felt like it was a little bit like the movie The Birds, the Alfred Hitchcock movie, but with bicycles, and there are bicycles everywhere. And so what if you ask a Dutch English bilingual, how do you call that object? You could go up to a young child and say, what's that object? And they'd say, in English, they'd say bike. In Dutch, it's fiets. Well, the observation and the point is that even the simplest decision about what to call the most common object in your environment has a choice for a bilingual. Now, for monolinguals, their choice is true because we have synonyms, we have a lot of different options for how we call things. But bilinguals, that explodes. We now have more options in the two languages, so we have to decide which language to speak, and we have to decide which words to choose to speak them. And so asking how a bilingual selects a given language at any moment in time is really crucial, and what the evidence suggests is that both alternatives are active, at least briefly, before the bilingual comes to a determination of what they're going to say. So let me just provide a tiny, tiny snippet of evidence to illustrate how we think this is true, why we think this is true. And this is an example from an old study done with Anna Schwartz and Michelle Diaz, where we did something utterly simple. We asked English-Spanish bilinguals to name words aloud. You see a word on a computer screen, you say it. And what we did is we showed them a bunch of words in English, and then we showed them a bunch of words in Spanish. We never showed them together, and we just said, say them aloud. The twist in this experiment is some of the words were cognates, like piano and bass, but sometimes the cognate had a pronunciation in the other language that was very similar. The phonology was closely matched. So the phonology is never going to be identical in the two languages, but if you say piano or piano in Spanish, they're pretty similar. Whereas if you say bass and basse, they're very different. So what we wanted to know was, would bilinguals, when they were naming words in one language alone, be affected by the fact that the pair, the cognate translation, had a similar or different pronunciation? And what we found was that the time to begin to articulate this word was a function of whether or not the phonology matched, whether it converged, or whether it conflicted. And so the black bar is when it converged, the red bar is when it conflicted. We got the same result in both languages. So it happened whether they were speaking Spanish or whether they were speaking English. And so bilinguals are faster to name cognates when you have this convergence across the phonology. And what that suggests is that given that they named only in English or only in Spanish, it suggested that the other language was available to them even though they were naming in one language alone. What happens when you do this experiment with monolingual speakers of English? This is one of the benefits of being in Pennsylvania that I lost when I went to California. There are monolinguals in Pennsylvania. Those monolinguals did the same experiment for us in English. They show nothing. They're insensitive. So what it means is that this isn't something about these particular words. It's something about their bilingualism that's happening. Okay, now, you might think if you speak two languages like sign language and English, that you wouldn't show these effects. Sign language is completely different. You're articulating with your hands, not with your vocal apparatus. This is a study we did with deaf college students. And we had them perform a test where they saw two words, and they had to decide whether the two words in English were semantically related to one another. So you see two words like movie and paper, you just hit a button. Yes or no, are they related to one another? And here's the twist in this experiment. In this experiment, sometimes the sign translation of the words resembled each other. They were something similar about the hand shape or the placement of the ASL signs. Other times, the translations in ASL were different. So the question we asked, if we asked deaf students to perform this test in English, and these are college students who are reading everything in English, they're highly proficient in English, and there's no sign language presented in the experiment. They just do the whole thing in written English. And the question is, are they influenced by whether there's a conflict present in the ASL translation? And the answer to the question is yes. What happens is that if you have to say, yes, these two words are semantically related, and the ASL signs look different from one another, you are slower than when you have to say, no, they're not related, and the ASL signs are the same or very similar. So you're being influenced, they are influenced by the translation in American Sign Language when they're making a decision in English that they're reading. And so this suggests that we have cross-language co-activation regardless of whether the two languages are similar to one another or not, or have perceptual similarities or similar articulatory information. These cross-language interactions are persistent. It's not just about words. We see it at the lexical level for words, certainly. We see it in languages like Japanese and English, Chinese and English. And so we see it regardless of the obvious kind of similarity between the two languages. We see it in the grammar. We see it at the level of the phonology. So there is co-activation, or what's been called non-selectivity, suggesting that both languages are always active. Okay, so what's the consequence? The claim, a hypothesis, is that all of this juggling of the two languages may tune brain networks that enable control and build cognitive reserve. And that this control may particularly require that bilinguals learn to regulate the native language. Now, the early story was that, oh, bilinguals juggle all this information, there's a lot of competition, so you become a really good juggler. And that's certainly an appealing story, the idea that you become very skilled at having all this information present, and it's certainly a piece of the story that's important. But the argument that we and others have made is that it can't be quite that simple. It's got to be that you're learning in particular how to deal with the fact that your native language, as well as a second language, may be effective. And so I want to just talk briefly and give you some illustrations about how we see those effects and how the native language may change in response to learning and using a second language. And so the argument is that, and I'm using kind of rough and dirty language here, but that the native language may take a hit. And what I mean by that is that there may be some cost associated with using a second language that changes the native language. There may be costs early in learning. We think that those costs may actually translate to benefits later on, but we see changes in the native language, and those changes critically are not atypical or abnormal or bad. We think they are a typical aspect of the dynamic of second language learning. We see it when learners are immersed in a second language environment, like in study abroad or traveling. We see that the native language is suppressed. And many of you may have phenomenology. You go abroad, and even if you're not trying to learn another language, you may be in another context, and you hear the other language, and for a moment you can't retrieve your native language anymore, and you think, oh my God, I have aphasia. And you don't have aphasia. What you have is you're experiencing this sort of normal dynamic of having the input, the language input you're getting is modulating your access to your native language. And we see it not just for learners, we see it for proficient bilinguals. And we believe that bilinguals may have to learn to regulate the native language to enable proficient performance in the second language. So this is one example from a recent study, a study with my graduate student, Kinsey Weiss. And this is a study that was addressed to this issue of whether good second language learners are people who show sensitivity to the L2 early in learning. So if you can accept this hit to your native language relatively early, you may be, we're in the process of testing this hypothesis, but you may be a person who may be poised to be more effective in achieving second language skill. Now, normally we expect the dominant language to affect the weaker language, and there's a history of research on second language acquisition that shows that, and that absolutely happens. But here we're asking the reverse: does the second language affect the first? And we did a study, not actually pictures present, but just to illustrate this again, we have cognates, so words that are similar in English and Spanish, tomato in English, tomate in Spanish. The question was whether newly acquired Spanish would come to influence English. And we did a study where we used EEG. And the reason we use EEG is that EEG seems to be very sensitive to early stages of learning and brain activity, even before some information is consciously available. And what we found in the study is that in the EEG, and we're looking at English, these are all, students of Penn State, they're native English speakers, they're enrolled in Spanish classes, they live in a prosthetic environment in terms of bilingualism, right? This is a very monolingual environment. And so the English is their native language, and they just go to Spanish class 4 days a week. And what we see is we see that they begin to show effects of Spanish on English early in learning. They don't show it in behavior, but they show it in the EEG. And so this is a little piece of EEG data looking at CZ, which is, if you know something about EEG data, this is right in the middle of your head. What we find is that monolinguals, over here on the left, show absolutely nothing. This is looking at cognates versus non-cognates. So monolinguals are immune to these effects in brain activity. Beginning learners are beginning to show some sensitivity in the N400 range in the EEG. What do we see for intermediate learners? They show a significant N400. I'm not going to take the time today to go into all the EEG interpretation. But basically the idea is that the brains of these learners are beginning to be sensitive in English to the influence of the Spanish, even though English is their native language. When we test them behaviorally, they show no difference behaviorally. They look just like the monolinguals. So what this suggests is that we're beginning to see some influence of the L2 on the L1. And our hypothesis is that this influence may really be critical, and in another area of research on memory and learning, we think that this may be related to some of the claims for desirable difficulties in learning, that this may really be a kind of difficulty that's an important difficulty in understanding how the consequence of difficult learning may come to regulate the outcomes that we observe. In work that Roxana has done in a very, very sort of similar spirit, looking at, we know that it's harder for English speakers to produce the names of words that they read when those words are irregularly pronounced. If you have a child who's learning to read, these are the hilarious spelling errors that we see. I had my grandson, who's 6.5, wrote something to my daughter that said that Grandma Judy was wrong. R-O-N-G, wrong. And I thought, it's great, he's literate, but he doesn't quite have the spelling down. So we know that normally we see this sort of regularity effect, and the data on the left is for English monolinguals. You can see that we see that monolinguals are slower to name exception words than to name regularly spelled words. Okay, what happens is that if you look at English speakers, native English speakers, who are now learning Spanish, well, Spanish doesn't have this regularity effect. Spanish is a language with shallow orthography. What you see is what you get. And now they're learning Spanish, and what's happened is it looks like the experience that they have with Spanish and the shallow orthography is beginning to disrupt what they're doing in English. And so what we see in this study is that the English learners at a very early stage, low Spanish proficiency, so beginning to learn, the effect goes away in English. Once they become more proficient in Spanish, the effect comes back. So you don't lose something. You're not losing this feature of your native language, but it's being disrupted while learning is occurring. And so one of the very exciting findings is that these results really converge in arguing that there may be some fundamental change in these dynamics that we need to understand in the native language. So the question is really how does that happen at other levels? One of the things that's hardest to do when you're a learner of a second language is to speak it. And we've done a lot of studies on looking at language production. This is a study of relatively proficient Chinese-English bilinguals, and it shows a similar kind of consequence of the L2 on the L1, even for higher proficient speakers. We did an experiment that, again, is saying ad nauseum, utterly simple. We asked people to name a bunch of pictures, and we show them a bunch of pictures in one, and we say name them in one language, and then we show them a set of pictures and the same pictures, and we say name them in the other language. And we didn't actually present them in the same order, and just graphically challenged them, making up PowerPoint slides. So we randomized the order of the pictures. So here's the idea of this experiment. We had these proficient bilinguals either name the pictures in Chinese, which is their L1 first, or name the pictures in English first. And we just asked the question, would you get a benefit of naming the same pictures twice if you switch the language? Now, what would you expect? Normally, what we expect, and we know from many, many behavioral studies, that there is repetition from it. You benefit. If I named that dog once, and I see the same picture of the dog later, I should benefit in naming. I should get some kind of facilitation later on. Okay, the question is, would you see that and would it work in both languages? And again, this is a little tiny bit of the EEG data. Okay, so what we found, if we look at L2 first, and for those of you not familiar with reading these sort of ERP plots, not to worry, just focus on one thing, the blue versus the red. Do you see that the blue is above the red? Okay, in the EEG lingo here, the blue is more negative than the red. The blue is when you spoke L2 first, and the red is when the L1, and when the L2 came after the L1. And so do you see how the red is below the blue? What you're finding what we found for the L2 is that there was facilitation. There was a pattern that was consistent with the idea that the EEG wave was less negative after you had the experience of being in the picture before. If you look at the data on the left, this was a surprise. If you have to name a picture in your L1 after you've just been speaking L2, you find increased negativity. You find a pattern that's consistent with inhibition of the L1. So you name a bunch of pictures in your second language, which for these people was English, then they switch to Chinese. And they are now they are apparently inhibited in being able to produce a name of the Chinese. Now we thought at first, okay, this is just a matter of recovering, right? You name a couple of pictures in Chinese, and then you're fine. You recover, and you're back to your normal state. And what we found in this study is that this inhibitory pattern lasts through the entire experiment. In fact, we didn't tell the IRB about this. We might have gotten into big trouble if they knew that we were leaving our participants in a different state than they entered the study. But we didn't anticipate finding this result. So the point is that we find persistent inhibition of the native language after the second language is produced. And we find very little evidence of this in behavior in this study, but we find persistent evidence in the EEG again. And very clearly, inhibitory control is a very, very complex topic, and there's a lot of research that's ongoing that I'm not going to have time to go into a lot of detail about today, but a focus in the recent research is to understand how there may be different brain networks that support different types of inhibitory control in language production. And the claim in the literature is that there are different loci on the brain that may be responsible for these different inhibitory control components. And we've done some fMRI studies to, in fact, look at this issue, and I'm happy to talk about them later. Again, the critical thing in the fMRI studies, it's the L1 that's affected. It's always the L1 that's affected. And so what we're seeing is that to use the second language, it looks like even highly proficient bilinguals need to modulate their use of the native language. So can we see these effects in other contexts? These are all laboratory studies, maybe pictures. You might say, okay, that's really fine, but it's not so interesting. We see it when people are immersed. In one study that we performed, this was a study with a former graduate student, Jared Link, and Gretchen Sunderman. Jared had been as an undergraduate, he had studied abroad in Salamanca, Spain, and he was desperate to find a way that he could go back to Salamanca, Spain as a graduate student. And so he did this wonderful study there. He went and did a study where he compared classroom learners at Penn State with students who were intermediate learners of Spanish but immersed in Salamanca. And we did, I'm not going to go into all the data today, but he looked at performance both on language production tasks and language comprehension tasks in these two contexts. And we biased the experiment to begin with. We wanted to make sure that, if anything, the people in the classroom at Penn State were more proficient than the people who were immersed. So we start with a bias to make sure that any advantage associated with immersion is not due to some inherent difference between the two groups. And the data that I want to show you are from a category fluency task. A verbal fluency task is often used in clinical settings where you're given name of a category like fruits, and I ask you in 30 seconds, say as many fruits as you can. You may think this is really easy, but if you try it with your friends, you'll see that after about 30 seconds you begin to run out very quickly. Okay, so first of all, would you expect more in the L1 or in the L2? These are students who are intermediate learners of Spanish. They're native English speakers. Are they going to produce more English or more Spanish? English, right? They're native English speakers. Okay, and that's what happens. The bars on the left are the English, and this is the number of exemplars they produce. And the bars on the right are Spanish. They all produce more English than Spanish, and that makes sense. But here's the critical result. In Spanish, by the way, do you see how the red bar is higher than the black bar? The immersed students produce more Spanish than the non-immersed students. And that's good. It means that the money for study abroad is going down. But here's the interesting result. The interesting results on the left for English. The students who are immersed in Salamanca are native English speakers. They produce less in English. Their English is suppressed while even though they're dominant English speakers, it's their native language, their English is suppressed. The English takes a hit under these immersion conditions. And a lot of other data that I can't show you here that supports this idea. Now, the native language is not the rock of Gibraltar. And what we see in these studies is that not only does the L1 influence the L2, but the L2 has persistent effects on the L1. But very critically, language is not just about words. And the examples that I've been giving you so far are all lexical examples about words. And we want to see that there are other levels of language processing where you see similar phenomena. And I'm just going to illustrate with one. It's one from my colleague Judith at Penn State. And it's really quite a dramatic example. It's about the grammar. Many of these transfer studies showing effects of L1 and L2 have come from studies of grammar. And it makes sense. When you're first learning a second language, you transfer what you know from the first language to the second. So she asked, how do the structural commitments of one language influence the other? And so she gave people sentences to look at what's known as relative. This is looking at relative attachment. Relative clause attachment, where you have Peter fell in love with the daughter of the psychologist who studied in California. Who studied in California? These are a mouthful, I know. Well, Peter fell in love with the daughter of the psychologist who studied in California. If you ask a native English speaker, you can see what your intuitions are. A native English speaker said it's like a psychologist who studied in California. But if you ask a native Spanish speaker, they say it was the daughter. Native English speakers attach low. Native Spanish speakers attach high, if we were going to diagram a sentence here. Now, okay, and if you do these experiments, and they've been done with monolingual speakers in each language, and so you get these attachment preferences. Here's the crucial result. What she found is that native Spanish speakers immersed in the US who had become highly proficient in English as a second language, but who hadn't tried it in Spanish, they use Spanish all the time. It's not only that they parse English the way native English speakers do, they start to parse Spanish like English. They start to prefer low attachment in Spanish, which is a language as a monolingual native speaker wouldn't do that. So what you see is you see an effect of the L2 on the L1 at the level of the grammar. And it's important to point out that the grammar is what, in classical debates about constraints on second language learning, it's the grammar that's been considered really precious and privileged. And what we see in these studies is that even the grammar is open to this openness in change from one language to the other. Okay, to go on and try to finish up as quickly as I think we started a little bit, so a few more minutes. Okay, so I started the talk today by talking about some of the consequences of bilingualism, and I want to come back to this now at the end to consider how bilingualism may really have larger effects on cognition and the brain more generally. And the claim that I want to make is that we really need to understand these regulatory processes and we need to understand that the way bilinguals regulate and control their two languages may not be simple main effects, that this may be a complex phenomenon. And so we can ask the question whether this ability to regulate the native language enhances cognitive control. And I want to try to illustrate today why this may be complex, but also extremely reliable and regular. So why we as researchers may need to go beyond saying, is there a bilingual advantage or not, and now ask the question, how do these different experiences with two languages potentially change the way we engage cognitive control mechanisms? And I'm going to start with an example that comes from a task that's been used a lot in the literature, the cognitive literature on inhibitory control. And it's called the AXCPT task. And for our purposes today, we don't, I'm missing the, oh, here we go, fancy PowerPoint. So what happens in the AXCPT task is that you get a cue, like the letter A, and then you get a bunch of distractor letters, F, M, N, D, and then you get this probe, X. And what you're told is if you see the X at the end when the A began, hit the yes key. If you see anything else, say no. So if I present B, and then you get the sequence and you see X, you say no. If I present A, and then you get Y at the end, you say no. Okay, so you're set up to predict a particular sequence. And the claim has been made, and again, I don't have time to go into detail today about how this works, but the idea is that we may have both proactive and reactive control mechanisms. So we both set ourselves up to pay attention to something that we may be expecting, but we also have things as they unfold where we have to catch them when there's a potential error. Okay, so, whoops. So, this is a study by Julio Morales and colleagues in Granada, Spain, and here's what they did. They asked the question, are bilinguals better, both in this AXCPT task, in this inhibitory control task, than monolinguals? And are bilinguals better in a stop signal task? And the best way I can explain stop signal is imagine that you're driving, now living in California and having to drive on these horrific freeways. I can tell you that this is very relevant to my life. It's not just a laboratory task. So something happens and you have to just stop right away, right? You have to stop really quickly. So you start some process and then you're told to stop. And so they asked the question, are bilinguals better than monolinguals? Here's what they found that was interesting. They found that there was not really a bilingual advantage on these tasks. Bilinguals were not overall, they were a little bit better on one of the components of the AXCPT, but there was nothing to write home about. Bilinguals were not better than monolinguals. But then they dug into the data and the relationship between these different tasks, and what they found is that there was a relationship. What you have on the y-axis here is the time it took people to perform the stop signal task. And what you have on the x-axis are the errors they make in this particular part of the AXCPT inhibitory control task. And what they found, and what you can see, is the monolingual data are flat. So the monolingual's performance was not modulated by inhibitory control. Whereas for the bilinguals, you can see that there's a relationship between their ability to perform the inhibitory control task and their ability to perform on the stop signal task. And so what that suggests is that it suggests that there's coordination, that what bilinguals may be advantaged, not overall, they may be advantaged in the sense that they may differently control the way different sources of information are coordinated. And we see that kind of effect in many different places now. So the use of the two languages may impose processing demands that create very distinct profiles of cognition. One claim that's been made, a claim by Green and Levy, is something called the adaptive control model. The idea is that not all bilingual experiences are the same, and not all language contexts produce the same demands on us. And one of the examples I give is bilinguals code switch. Some bilinguals code switch, some bilinguals don't code switch. Where code switching is just mixing in the middle of an utterance. You may start in Spanish and end in English, or the reverse. And what they know is that we may have two people who are equally proficient bilinguals, one of whom may code switch all the time, the other may not code switch at all. Their experience is very different. Likewise, you may have two bilinguals, each of whom code switches all the time. But one of those bilinguals may live in an environment where everybody code switches and everybody speaks the same two languages. And so they don't have to stop for a second to think about, who can I speak with in which language? Whereas a person who lives in a more diverse environment may have to be continually monitoring who they're speaking to. So all of this is just an example that we can't just talk about bilinguals, and we can't talk about just monolinguals. We need to talk about the context people live in and the demands that are placed on their language processing, and that may really be crucial. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that it's very hard to test these hypotheses. It's very hard to get a really clear handle on who the bilinguals are. There's been some fascinating research on bimodal bilinguals, and in this case, it's not deaf bimodal bilinguals, but hearing bimodal bilinguals. And so there are hearing individuals who learn ASL. Some of them are CODAs, children of deaf adults, who have grown up with parents who are deaf, but who are not deaf themselves. And so they are early bilinguals in ASL and English, but they have a bit of hearing, so they can also speak. Other people are late ASL bilinguals, where they have decided to learn ASL as an adult. Karen Emery, who's at San Diego State University, has really done groundbreaking work on looking at this group. They do this study with the same flanker kind of study with behavioral, with bimodal bilinguals, and with unimodal bilinguals, with speech-speech bilinguals. It turns out that the bimodal bilinguals do not show an advantage in the executive function test. So you go home and just shut it all off and say negative evidence. Well, what they said, which is really interesting, is they said, look, if you're a hearing person, so you speak, and you also sign, you can co-gesture. You can actually be signing and speaking at the same time. If you're a bilingual who speaks both languages, unless you really know a trick to speak out of both sides of your mouth, you can't speak both languages at the same time. You have to choose which language. And so what they argue is that you see an advantage for the speech-speech bilinguals that you don't see for the bimodal bilinguals, because the bimodal bilinguals don't have to make the same decision. So they just simply don't show the same consequence that the unimodal bilinguals do. And there was a recent neuroimaging paper by another group, this is by Guinevere Eden's group at Georgetown, that basically produced structural imaging data looking at gray matter density that supported the claim that Emery and colleagues made. What they found is that there were changes in gray matter volume only for speech-speech bilinguals and not for bimodal bilinguals. I would argue that these data are preliminary. We don't have a lot of studies that have looked at this, but I think it's really interesting in trying to identify a causal mechanism that may explain how we see these consequences of bilingualism. So I'm going to finish up just with one more example, and then I'll promise I'll stop. In 1989, François Grosjean, who's also a pioneer in the study of bilingualism, wrote a paper called, a very belligerent paper called Neurolinguists Beware, the Bilingual is Not Two Monolinguals in One. It was a nasty paper. And the reason he wrote this paper is that there was a study, and it wasn't a aphasia study, it was a neuropsychology study, where language mixing was being identified as pathology in a patient. And so in a report of an aphasic patient, the idea that the person was mixing languages was seen as being pathological. Grosjean argued that's ridiculous because language mixing is a normal aspect of being bilingual, it's a typical aspect of being bilingual. And the recent evidence suggests that Grosjean was right, and actually goes a step further to suggest that code switching, so the switching from one language to the other, even in the middle of an utterance, may actually underlie some of these observed consequences of bilingualism. So I want to just tell you quickly the results of two studies. This is a study that just came out, also from Julie Jusius's lab at Penn State, with her graduate student, Annie B.D. Martinez. And what they did is they looked at two groups of bilinguals. And they had two groups of bilinguals who were highly proficient speakers. They were native Spanish speakers who were very proficient in English. And one group were in the US. They were Puerto Rican speakers who were living in Pennsylvania. The other group were in Granada, Spain. Now these two groups are, you can match them very, very closely. And they're highly proficient. They perform similarly on tasks of English and Spanish grammar and lexical retrieval. But the difference is that in Spain, they don't code switch. Whereas the Puerto Rican speakers in the US code switch like crazy. So you have a group of habitual code switchers and a group of non-habitual code switchers. And what they did is they had them read sentences in which there were gender congruent or incongruent determiner noun code switches. So like la spoon versus el spoon. So el spoon is incongruent because it's la cuchara, and la spoon would be congruent. And they used EG, and what they found is they found that it's not that the non-code switchers were insensitive entirely, but for the code switchers, they were exquisitely sensitive to the direction of the switch. Whereas the non-code switchers show an early frontal pattern in the EG, but that was independent of the switch type. So the point is that both groups are highly proficient in exactly the same languages, and what we see is they're not the same. The code switching experience they've had changes the way they comprehend this material. Now in the final study that I'm going to mention, this is with my colleague Judith and a postdoc who worked with us, Melinda Fricke, who's now on the faculty in linguistics at the University of Pittsburgh. And Melinda had a wild and woolly idea when she came to our lab, and we said, it's not going to work, and it worked. Here's the idea. Her idea was that when people code switch, when bilinguals code switch, that they're actually tuned in to very, very subtle phonetic cues that are being produced that allow them to anticipate those switches coming up. And so what, and this fits with work on, there's a lot of work in psycholinguistics on alignment, the idea that people, speakers and listeners align to one another, they tune to one another. And so what she did is we looked at corpora. We looked at this corpus, this Miami Bangor corpus, which is a corpus of naturally occurring Spanish-English bilingual speech, where people are just sitting having a conversation about anything we want to talk about. And Melinda went back and extracted from the corpus examples where there were code switch utterances. And what she then did is she analyzed the acoustics of the utterance. And the question is, what happens? And what she found is that speech rate slows down prior to a code switch. And those phonetic changes occur prior but not following the switch. And so what we see is that prior to a switch, the English consonants become more Spanish-like, and following a switch, there's not any evidence of cross-language influence. And what's notable is that some of these acoustic changes would not necessarily be obvious to your naked ear. Okay. So now the question is, can bilinguals even exploit that information? So speakers may change the way they're going to speak as they're about to produce the switch, but can listeners appreciate that? And what we did, and I'm not going to go into the detail here, but what we did is we used a visual world paradigm where they heard the speech. And what we did is we manipulated the acoustics in the probe that was presented. And what we found is that, in fact, habitual code switches are able, if we're a different group, not the group who produced the corpus data, are able to anticipate a switch. They move their eyes in a way when they're reading this material that suggests that they are able to exploit what they've just heard, even though it's a very subtle phonetic change. And so the argument we want to make is that code-switching bilinguals have learned to dance with one another. They're doing the tango with one another. We don't know exactly how that tunes these cognitive networks, but we think it's very likely that this sort of very complex alignment behavior really may be very important. So let me just finish. And it's really important to be humble here. There's a great deal that we don't know. Among the goals for the next stage of research, we want to know how bilingual does a person have to be? What if we haven't used the other language for a while? Bilingualism is not categorical. Does it matter if the other language is a majority or minority language in the society in which you reside? Does it matter whether the bilingual is a heritage speaker? Where I live now and where I work now at UC Riverside, I have this fantastic opportunity to study heritage speakers, to look at how a particular experience with the home language may impact performance, not just in children, but in adults who have different history with their language experience. Does age of acquisition really matter? Recent studies suggest that we don't want to brush that off too quickly. There may be effects of early bilingualism that are really important. They may not be exactly the effects that were claimed initially. And finally here, there's not sufficient attention to monolinguals. Not all monolinguals are the same, and we need to really pay attention to the fact that monolinguals differ in their proficiency and their facility with their one and only language. And again, being in Southern California now, it's very clear that if you're a monolingual speaker and you walk through the campus at UCR, you hear all these other languages all day long. Whereas if you're a monolingual speaker and you're at Penn State, you hear English all day long. Do we know how that affects your performance on these tasks? We don't, and we really need to take that into account. And finally, I've said nothing about babies. The research on bilingually exposed babies is fabulous. It suggests that there are changes that occur within the first few months of life. They are, as I told you about the Patricia Kroll-Meg study at the very beginning, these changes, bilingual babies are not. The mythology is that they're going to be confused by two languages. The opposite is true. What we see is that their brains are tuned in ways that open them to speech and that have enduring consequences across their whole life. So I'm going to end by just saying that the bilingual may indeed be a mental juggler, and the science of this is really at the very much at the beginning. And my message is not simply that things are complex, because I think they are, but that research on bilingualism holds enormous promise for revealing fundamental principles about language, cognition, and its neural basis. So bilingualism is a lens. We would know none of this if we studied only monolinguals. And the implications are not just for our interest and curiosity. I want to argue that they require a revision about the story, the traditional story about language development and about the plasticity associated with adult learning. I think there are cause for great optimism about adult learning. But still, there are some adults who are simply not that flexible. There are some adults who, for them, it may be too late to start.